Welcome to today's video where we'll be covering the topic of the history of watercolor. So get comfortable, relax, enjoy, and listen. The evolution of watercolor painting arguably began in antiquity, when prehistoric humans painted cave walls using charcoal, ochre, and other natural pigments mixed with water to create visual representations of animals and humans. From this primitive beginning, innovations such as the development of paper, the improvements in pigments, and the awareness of aesthetic techniques contributed to the growth of watercolor as a fine art medium. It was later popularized when the Egyptians used water-based paints to letter and paint images on papyrus paper after its invention. But, due to the fragile nature of papyrus paper, only pieces stored in dark and dry climates of pyramids have survived. In traditional Chinese art, watercolor developed around 4000 BCE. Primarily as a medium of decorative art. Watercolor was painted often in monochrome black or browns using ink stick or other pigments, on silk and later on handmade papers. By the 4th century CE, watercolor landscapes had become established as an independent form of Chinese painting, and would eventually dominate all Chinese brush painting. Ancient Chinese art has two main techniques, one of which is an ink and wash painting, in Chinese shui mo, also loosely termed watercolor or brush painting. China was advanced in manufacturing paper since the ancient times. It wasn't until the Moors who brought papermaking to Spain in the 12th century, which soon spread to Italy, was when watercolor started to pick up speed in Europe. Now, two of the oldest paper manufacturers include Arches of France, which opened in 1492, and Fabriano of Italy, which opened in 1276. As such, watercolor came to Western artists in the late 1400s. Artists had to formulate, prepare, and grind their own watercolor paint, intended to keep their secret recipes and methods to themselves. During the Middle Ages in Europe, monks used tempera to create illuminated manuscripts. Pigment was painted on paper made of linen rags. Tempera paint is a mixture of pigment and egg yolk. It is thicker than gouache and watercolor. These books were considered a major form of art, equivalent to easel painting in later years. The most famous illuminated book was by the Limburg brothers, Paul, Hermann, and Jean. Like medieval artists, Renaissance artists painted frescoes, a method in which water-based pigments were painted onto wet plaster. The most recognizable piece of work during this time being made this way is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, completed in 1512. Since paper was considered a luxury item in these early ages, traditional Western watercolor painting was slow in evolving. The increased availability of paper by the 14th century finally allowed for the possibility of drawing as an artistic activity. So, artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo began to develop drawings as a tool for practice and for recording information. During this time, watercolor, in the modern sense, was used to create miniature portraits or studies. Previously, artists had to make their own paints, including watercolor, from scratch. However, the advent of ready-made paints and synthetic pigments included watercolor's growth as a medium. Modern watercolor painting has its roots in the Northern Renaissance. During the 15th century, printmaker Albrecht Dürer was one of the first artists to recognize the potential of this medium. His early watercolor paintings focused on depicting topography, but over time he placed much greater emphasis on capturing atmosphere. He also produced highly realistic nature studies, typically combining watercolor and gouache on paper. It was not until the late 18th century that special papers were produced exclusively for watercolor paintings, specially treated and sized. As well as in the 18th century, the first paint manufacturers set up shop in major European cities. They not only provided the basic pigments, resins, and oils, but found a market for ready-made color pastes and other artist equipment. In the 18th century, gouache was an important medium for the Italian and French artists, while in the 19th century, the influence of the English school helped popularize transparent watercolor in France, and it became a much more important medium. Watercolor painting is commonly associated with the achievements of the English school of landscape painters, especially Paul Sandby, Thomas Girton, and J.M.W. Turner. This group was active from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, the so-called Golden Age of watercolor. Initially, the artists restricted their paintings to tint washes. This is a drawing made in ink or pencil, and a brush and water is used to spread the ink to create a tint effect. A restricted range of colors were allowed, but the overall effect was quite monochromatic. While some artists continued to create tinted drawings, others began to push the boundaries. Artists like William Pars, John Warwick Smith, Thomas Girton, and Turner began using a wider palette of stronger colors to create a more painterly effect. Watercolors soon became popular throughout the UK with an upsurge in wildlife and plant paintings, as well as new demands for plein air paintings to replicate the scenes and topography of both tourist and military sites, and to accompany archaeological and anthropological expeditions around the globe in order to document images of flora and fauna. Botanical illustration and wildlife illustration perhaps form the oldest and most important traditions in watercolor painting. Botanical artists have traditionally been some of the most exacting and accomplished watercolor painters. Even today, watercolors, with their unique ability to summarize, clarify, and idealize in full color, are used to illustrate scientific and museum publications. Wildlife illustration reached its peak in the 19th century with artists such as John James Audubon, an American artist, and today many naturalist field guides are still illustrated with watercolor paintings. American artists did not emerge on their own until the same time period. In the early 19th century, masters like Winslow Homer, James Whistler, John Singer Sargent, and Thomas Eakins created work on par with or greater than the Europeans. America's contribution to the international watercolor tradition is second to none. Although the British dominated that tradition in the past, American artists have produced a substantial and varied body of work in watercolor that is unmatched elsewhere in the world since the late 18th century. By the late 1870s, artist societies promoted watercolor, successfully bringing the medium into mainstream America. The American watercolor movement of this period paved the way for later watercolorists to be seriously received in exhibition with artists painting in other media. What was once largely considered as a medium used to sketch or create studies with for larger paintings is now becoming a medium that is used for final, fully rendered works to be displayed in galleries. In the 21st century, very few historical watercolor paintings, if any, are as famous as oil paintings. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, watercolor paints fade much faster than oil paints when exposed to light. They lose their vibrancy and can look washed out very quickly. This is why the best art museums typically display their watercolor collection only for limited periods of time. For the remainder of the time, the paintings are stored in dark, temperature-controlled basements. Secondly, most watercolors are painted on paper, which is more prone to damage and decay than canvas or wood. As a result, most masterpieces of watercolor painting simply have not survived the test of time. So, if you see watercolor paintings on display in an art museum, be sure to take your time to appreciate the work, as it will be put away for however long until the next time it gets to shine. I hope you enjoyed today's video, maybe learned something new, had fun watching me paint. Maybe you painted along. Whatever it was that you did while consuming this video, I hope you really enjoyed it and found it worth your time. Let me know what I should talk about next. What history topics do you want me to cover? Maybe what paintings? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you come back for another one. And if you're still around, why don't you check out my Patreon? Over there, I've uploaded a companion video to this one, where I talk about watercolor tips and techniques. 22 minutes long of me explaining the knowledge I received from a watercolor class on tools and techniques used for watercolor. Here I've given you guys a teaser of the 2 paintings I worked on for this Patreon video. Otherwise, I have tons of content uploaded of process photos of illustrations, speed paints both digital and traditional, and Patreon exclusive content of my personal project Walking the 𝕤𝕒𝕚𝕚. I'll see you there. Have a good one.